could be a proper drink, but it has been brought in uko kichini chini to evade tax, right?
Smuggled, yes.
Smuggled into the country.
Yes.
And then there's unregulated. Unregulated includes traditional brews.
Yes.
Somebody having some muratina somewhere, they've made muratina, they're kunywaing, they've followed all the process of making muratina. You consider that illicit.
Yes.
Somebody taking busa somewhere, they've made their busa at home, they've followed all the right procedure, fermented the maize, whatever, you consider that illicit. And not all illicit is poisonous.
So, and to be honest, there is the reason why, and maybe let me speak more about the local brews, because local brews have a place in our society, our traditional ceremonies and all that. And most of these people who make local brews is actually an art, at times passed over generations. Somebody was taught by the grandfather or grandmother, and it passed down over a period of time. The only reason why it's considered to be illicit is because it's also unlawful. For example, you'll be told that for you to sell alcohol, you need to package it in a particular way. You need to have a KEBS mark. You need to have a KRA tax stamp. Tax has not been paid on it. So those are the aspects that make it illicit. And the sad bit is that at times, if you look at why at times is it still thriving, the local brew sector, and some of these people, they would probably even want to get into the legitimate space, because nobody wants to be in the Chang'ar river dens each and every day. But if you look at the cost of compliance that has been kept by the laws that exist, it's very high. For example, there are things you'll be told today, if you want to start your own distillery or brewery, you'll be told you should have a flow meter. You'll be told there are 3 flow meters or 2 that you need to have, which are monitored. You need to have these equipments. If you look at those costs of those flow meters, they're very expensive. So you find a situation whereby, for example, before you start, the compliance items that are there will cost you about 15 million. Some extent, depending on what you produce, it could be way up at 20 million. Now, in that local village, where do we expect people to have this 15 million? But that's the cost of being the legitimate player. And the sad situation also comes. Once you are a legitimate player, of course, the high excess taxes will still apply to you, which will also probably lose your customers, because your customers came there because you're affordable. So you would lose your customers to the next door vendor or the next door person who has not complied.
Sounds an awful lot like, because this den of competition is so stiff, that you'll do whatever you need to do to keep out folks who are actually, number one, making a living, number two, are actually providing an alternate source for folks who cannot afford what we are calling legitimate, because local brews have been consumed for centuries. They are part of culture.
Exactly.
They're a livelihood for very many people. I'm not even talking about the stuff that makes people blind. I'm talking about the stuff that you have at festivities in the community.
Proper murats done
properly.
Busa,
And if you want to be honest about it, the processes that they use for this distillation is the same process that the legitimate business is using today, that has been passed down to generations, but has now been formalized. It's the same process. So if that is the case, that we're saying it's a sad thing that they continue to, what would be the problem in saying, within the context or within the boxes where this local brew is actually manufactured, can we not standardize or set requirements within that setting whereby they would be able to meet the mark 1, 2, 3? But it sounds to me that if we did that, it would be an affront to the legitimate business, because competition would still be up there.
Actually, maybe just to take you back, there are standards that are there. For example, there are KEBS standards on making changa. So for sure, by the law, and we've never had a problem, neither do we want to have a challenge with that as legitimate players, because it's part of us, it's part of traditions at the end of the day. So the only thing I think that needs to be done, and maybe some policy direction needs to be driven on, how can you be able to uplift this person? How can you drive them into the compliant world? Because so long as we have this, cost of entry being that high, for you to get into that space, the government would require you to have these items, which are also mandated by law. So long as that cost of entry is high, it's actually a barrier.
Yeah.
So for us as legitimate players, we don't mind. We actually appreciate. There are even clauses which support such. For example, you can make it and the chief can approve for you to make it for a traditional brew. When you go to the villages, if there are traditional ceremonies, it can be made for domestic purpose or for traditional brew for that purpose, but not for commercial use. But since some of them want to get into commercial space, now they have a barrier that is there. And it's a barrier that maybe the law needs to be relooked at.
Does ABAC support traditional brews? Yes or no here?
Yes.
Okay. Does ABAC support the formalization of traditional brews?
Yes.
Does has ABAC had any kind of conversation or any campaign that says, we understand that part of this 59%, part of it is actually proper traditional brew, and we'd like it to come into the formal and legitimate market, and this is what we're doing to reach out to that, helping, because we have the muscle, we understand the laws, we have the know-how in terms of dealing with policy, pushing for policy that would formalize traditional brews?
Yes. So maybe just to take back, I mentioned, like, for example, the KEB standards.
Yep.
So you'd find, for example, as ABAC members, we sit down in the technical committees. You find representatives of, members from legitimate alcohol players will always be in a technical committee. So even in such forums, you find the standard exists because people who are in the technical committee were able to come up with something and say, this is a standard that makes sense. And if you look at what they are producing, you're right, some of the processes are more or less like what happens. Distillation is distillation at the end of the day. The only thing that we are seeing which is now endangering their lives is that some people are getting a bit more greedy, and now instead of using ethanol, they're using even methanol. Now, if you look at also, some of them are using ethanol but in excess format. And some of this ethanol is unfortunately being driven again by policy. So, for example, now, the other day I saw AFA, Agriculture and Food Authority, Sugar Directorate, has given a letter allowing for export of molasses. Now, what is happening? So long as you're able to export molasses from Kenya, and a lot of alcohol actually comes from the sugar cane that we get from Western Kenya. So we support a lot of farmers from that, and it's derived from molasses. But now we are finding a situation whereby Kenya Revenue Authority had come up with something, and maybe it's a government directive that come with a directive whereby if you are buying from, let's say, a local distiller, and you're buying what we call ENA, which is made from molasses, you pay excise at that point, which I think is actually a good thing. But now it's only being applied to our members, because what people have done, you form some small distillery in Uganda, Tanzania, or any bordering country, you buy molasses there.
Right.
In that regime, it doesn't require you to pay excise at the point of selling ENA. Then that ENA is converted in that regime, then it's actually smuggled into the country. And there's a lot of concealment that happens at the border. I know KRA is actually trying to work on it, and it has been supportive. There are some instances where they get it, but I think it's organized crime, so it's smart. So they bring it into the country. Then once it's brought into the country, now it's used to make the counterfeit. At times, it's taken to those places where you find the jerry cans, which were to be used as in a certain case somewhere.
Yeah.
So that is the level of issues that we are finding. And correctly, back to the homebrew situation, the homebrews have been there for centuries, but we need to have a rethink. What has been happening of late to make sure that we try to stop this illicit? Because illicit is now finding itself growing, because some of those people who now saying they're making homebrews, they're probably not, they didn't perfect the art, they got too greedy, they're selling every other thing. So that is something that we find as a challenge. And maybe Kenya, we pride ourselves as a powerhouse in East Africa. I think there are things we need to learn from our neighbors, such as Tanzania.
Okay.
And if you look at it, Tanzania, for the last about 6 years, they have never increased the cost of excise on alcohol. They have never.
Okay.
And you find people don't drink illicit brews, because so long as it's affordable, people opt to drink something that is legitimate. It's about choice to our people. Now, you also find that the same thing, like the other day I was looking at, Tanzania has actually gone, even on simple things like an excise stamp. They have actually reduced the cost of excise stamp. Kenya, we are still high on the cost of excise stamp. Despite the same service provider is actually the one supplying Tanzania. But here, Tanzania has reduced the excise stamp costs about a week ago by 22%. So you find all these are elements where you see the government of Tanzania is really trying to cap the issue. And for us, I think the main thing that we need to have a view and we need to just consider is, so long as legitimate alcohol is affordable, people have a choice. And this choice item, you can see it even in other sectors. For example, nowadays, people go to supermarket. Sometime back, tissue, you could choose per brand. Right now, somebody say tissue is tissue. And they look at the price, whichever is lowest or on offer, take it. We've seen in other sectors where you find even bar soaps. Somebody sometime back would have a bar soap for washing clothes, would have a different one to shower with, and you'll have a different
for dishes.
For dishes. But now you find somebody buys one, and because it's a cost of things, so this one is the one. Then you cut, especially the big one. You cut it into pieces
for kitchen,
for that
laundry, for bathroom.
Yes, and it's cheaper. So it is the same kind of thinking that is also happening in the alcohol space.
So you're saying, long and short, that if we reduce the taxes,
yes,
the cost of alcohol will come down.
Yes,
and if the cost of alcohol comes down, then the competition will be at price point.
Yes.
And people will then opt to come for the branded products.
Exactly.
That are legitimate.
Sure.
And they will not go for the unbranded, illicit products.
Sure.
Okay.
That is the argument.
Yes.
Do you think that what we see with the roundup of businesses by police and other security agencies, whether it comes to the chief's camp, etc., do you think that is the way to go? Because what happens is that people are scared, they throw the thing on the ground when they see the truck come in. Maybe they're arrested, they're taken in, after a couple of days they're let go, but guess what? Next weekend, they're back there at the thing. So do you think that that is a way to solve the problem?
Okay, it's not a sustainable way. Because, for example, maybe I can, for the last 6 months, as ABAC, we've had various engagement within the counties with the law enforcement agencies, particularly in Eastern region and Central Kenya region. And, we go meet and agree on what are the sustainable solutions. So doing what they call the raids is not sustainable. And it has reached to a level where some people even know these people will just do it today, then in 2 weeks, BAU, business as usual. So what does that person do? They just close down for that 2 weeks. And then when they hit, reduces. And the difference, actually, the high tax rate is actually, unfortunately, an incentive to do illicit. Because if you look at it this way, for ABAC members, some of our products are retailing at about 250 shillings, so they're about. And I'm talking about the 250 ml Mwananchi spirit, which is retailing at about that amount of money. But on the other side, you look at consumers are having access to something which is being sold at 100 shillings. Now, we know, and from what I told you, if 49% of the RRP is just excise and VAT, it is impossible to make it. In fact, for us, we are quite clear, even it is impossible to make alcohol and do anything if you don't sell it if you find something that is being sold at less than 185 shillings. And some of us, have economies of scale, so it should be cheaper for us. But for sure it is impossible to make it. But we find it there in the market. So, and there's always that trend when enforcement is enhanced, they go under a bit for some period of time, then they come back again. So for us, it's how do you bridge that gap? Let's learn from our neighbors, Uganda. Let's learn from Tanzania and see how can we be able to ensure that gap is not too high so that people cannot be